+1 Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your MC, Rich, and I'm joined by my co-MC, Rach Shelke. How are you doing, Rach?
I have done 3 cons in 4 weeks, and that is far more than man was intended to con.
It's like a conplosion that just happened. I'm glad that you've made it. This is another one of our discussion-related episodes where we are going to tackle a particular part of Powered by the Apocalypse gameplay. And this one is straight from Rach's head, and I'm so excited for you to kind of lead this one. But the question that we'd like to tackle tonight is, how do the principles for an Apocalypse Engine game shape the theme and tone? Now, what are principles? Let me steal a page from the Pandas Talking Games playbook here. Dictionary.com says it's an accepted or professed rule of action or conduct. Now, in Apocalypse Engine, principles are, as Urban Shadows describes, best practices that we've learned from running the game, or from Night Witches. They're techniques for hammering your agenda. They're given to the MC or the GM or what have you, and they describe the ways in which you approach and run the game. This game and no other. There are principles in common in many of the PBTA games, but the principles are not universal. Trust us, we checked.
I suggested principles as a topic to discuss, particularly in the context of themes and tones, and not necessarily just game mechanics, because they're a little bit of an overlooked part of the GM toolkit. Of the 3 structures given, there's the agenda, your moves, and your principles. Your agenda is your overall goals as the MC. Usually this list is brief and sets out what you're here to do as a master of ceremonies. For most games, this is about 3 bullet points. The moves, which everyone is familiar with, it is one of the big talking points, at least in terms of MCing, are how you react as an MC to the conversation the players are having. I find these get a lot of focus because they're at the forefront when you're MCing. It's also the side of the game that the players can get the clearest look at on their side of the table. I've had games that have gone a little bit off the rails, and there's been conversations along the lines of, well, why did you as the MC pick that hard move or pick that soft move? Because we can see that. The veil is very thin there, is what I'm saying.
Right.
This leaves us with principles, which, as you put it, are ways you approach and run the game. The most simple principles to grasp and understand are the ones that discuss how the MC interacts with the players. For example, be a fan of the players or be a fan of the characters, depending on how that's worded. Obviously means part of your principles are to focus the game towards those characters, what those characters want to do, what would be interesting to happen to those characters. Another common one that you see over various different versions of the engine is think off-screen. So consider what's going on in the background when the players aren't looking at things, because of course the plots are moving forward. This ties into mechanics such as clocks or storms, the general concept that, of course, antagonists and other forces are still going about their business even if the players aren't directly interacting with them.
Don't go the way of Fallout 4, I think I've referenced before, where you've got this main arching plot line, but you can get to it at your leisure.
It happens at the speed of plot, I swear. You don't look over there, nothing's going to happen. Everything's going to be frozen in time.
Another one is ask provocative questions and build on the answers. That's pretty universal for most of the games that we look through. And I think that's a great principle for how to conduct the game by asking questions, making it conversational, and don't just ask questions to make someone feel like they're involved. That now becomes part of the fiction. It's canon within the world that you're creating together.
Yes, I love asking questions that people have genuinely interesting reactions to because they hadn't thought of, give me a second, I need to think about this and establish this in the world. Sometimes it might be something, as I suggest, that they aren't paying attention to, or in some cases, particularly with newer players, it's a concept they're not familiar with because they're familiar with the concept that GM has a hard GMing position and the GM is God, effectively, so anything they bring to the table doesn't really matter. Even though that's a little dismissive, but that's the whole idea of the GM is God and the GM is here to set what the story is, and the rest of you just react.
Right. The GM lays out everything for you to interact and react to, but you don't insert any fiction outside of your character's skin.
Or to be even more aggressive about it, I've seen in some cases, if it's not on your character sheet, it's not real in the world of the game.
Yep, I've seen that. And I think that's led to a lot of the 10-page backstories that the traditional player lament for some GMs, and other players. Like, they've got their 10-page backstories because they have been trained through gameplay that if I haven't written it down, it will never come to pass in the way that I hope. It is all according to the GM.
And even then, you're relying on, I really hope the GM reads this, because what if they don't read one part closely enough and my plans of the thing that I was playing close to my chest never happens?
Right.
So the other side of principles, beyond the gameplay mechanics, are the ones that refer to genre and setting. And those are the ones I want to focus on tonight, because they are really interesting, both in terms of which ones are chosen, because some games are really light on them and others go really in depth to establish these are the parts of the setting of the world that you want to focus on. We're both familiar with the discussion that the Apocalypse engine really handles genre well, right?
Right. I think that where you don't have 100-page history of the world that you play in, like you might find in other RPGs, there are principles here to help evoke the world that you're going to create together, but to kind of lay down what expectations that the MC should have for building that. Not laying down the tracks, but helping to build a strong foundation for your house.
Yeah, they're keynotes rather than here's piles of setting that you have to internalize in order to portray the game world properly.
Right.
So these principles, really, when we pay attention to them as MCs, allow us to sharpen our focus and direct our game to where the game engine is going to play off of it better. For an example, I went through 3 of the more common urban fantasy titles within the Apocalypse engine catalog: Urban Shadows, Monster of the Week, and Monster Hearts. Urban fantasy is really close to my heart, and I'm not sure why, other than it's very popular in Toronto, and this predates even the current round of games.
Mm-hmm.
World of Darkness is a super big thing, or was a super big thing, and gamers a generation before me have very fond memories of going into goth bars in downtown Toronto and LARPing, and will tell these stories wistfully. My generation, on the other hand, really got into the Apocalypse engine through Monster Hearts. Monster Hearts was such a big deal. Monster Hearts is not all urban fantasy, though, even though it sometimes ends up getting categorized as that.
I was just going to jump in and say I'm also a big fan of urban fantasy, and I'm one of those ex-LARP, less LARP, a lot more tabletop. I had a 7-year-long chronicle of Vampire the Masquerade that spanned 3 editions of the game, so yeah, it means a lot to me too. So I'm very happy that you chose these 3 examples.
I am super excited to talk about them with you, because I think they show both the attempts to categorize genre in the engine and all of the weird nuances that you can see, and they're best reflected in the principles. Arguably, if you're going to sit down to run a game, you should know what that game is about.
That's kind of an assumption, yeah. I mean, it's why you bought the book, or it's why you sat down at the table with your friends, hopefully.
Hopefully. Although there's always a chance that your understanding of the game is not quite what the game is going to play out as. When I was running Urban Shadows at Queen City Conquest this weekend, I laid out the playbooks and I explained these are what the different archetypes are, and then encouraged players, while you've got that playbook in your hand, open it up, look over what that playbook wants to do. And if that doesn't quite match what you want your character to be, just come up to me and we will find a playbook that really matches what you want to do tonight. And that might not have the trappings that you assume are going to be there, because Urban Shadows in particular is very political focused and pointy in ways that others of the Apocalypse engine urban fantasy games aren't. Or pointy in different ways, because Monster Hearts can be outright vicious.
Yeah, and if you don't follow those principles, and I'm speaking from personal experience because I've got a few friends that I play Monster Hearts with, and when we veer away from those principles and play a little nicer, the moves don't stick and the game starts to fall away into some kind of free form aspect, and then all of a sudden we're not playing Monster Hearts anymore.
Exactly.
If you don't follow those principles.
The principle that stands out the most in terms of establishing what the emotional space should be for Monster Hearts is in Monster Hearts 2, embrace melodrama. I mean, that is so glorious. It's right there saying all of that sappy, angsty, emotionally loaded teenage drama. Yeah, just go for it. This is what you want to do. This is what you're here for.
Yeah, and if you embrace that melodrama, it's easy to evoke things straight from the CW or from Twilight movies or what have you. That's all part of the melodrama that you'll draw from. It's easy. Once you say, let's embrace it, then you don't have to feel shy about it. You just jump straight in.
Exactly. With Urban Shadows, it's a little bit differently framed. We have put the characters in the center of conflicts, political and personal, which highlights that this game is about conflict, both inter-character and within NPCs, but also highlights the political aspects and the personal ones because those tend to bleed over in a good Urban Shadows game. Because what you may want politically amongst your factions is not necessarily what would be best for you personally.
So if you look at Urban Shadows versus Monster Hearts, like Monster Hearts, you could embrace that melodrama in a journal. But in Urban Shadows, the characters are at the center of conflicts, political and personal, which means there's much more pieces of plots. There are things where people are acting to take care of things that are irritants to them or to try to solve the problems that they see.
Yeah, a conflict in Monster Hearts is going to have very different emotional weight than it does in Urban Shadows, but that difference strikes me as interesting. It's also important to remind your players as the MC, no, this is what we're going for here. I want you to, again, wallow in the angst, to be a little bit frank about it, with Monster Hearts.
Right.
But in Urban Shadows, I want you to be aware of, yes, you should have these emotional conflicts and have to make hard decisions, but you also have to keep your house in order. You can't just sit in navel gaze all day.
Exactly. What about Monster of the Week?
Put horror in everyday situations.
So different from the other two, man. It's a completely different approach. I like that. So what does it say to you when you read that?
This game is really about putting the horror into the mundane. It's about you go to a small town, everything looks okay, but there's something hidden beneath the surface. In Monster Hearts and Urban Shadows, you already know something is probably underneath the surface, unless you're, even if you're playing an Aware or The Mortal, you have a good idea. But in Monster of the Week, your characters are basically investigators. They are meant to be put into a situation and figure out what's going on and how to deal with it.
Right, and one of the things that's important about Monster of the Week is if you look at how the big bad or the main boss, because that's what you're after as an investigator, you're going to take down that main enemy, you have to discover what their fatal flaw is, or you can't take them down. So you as an MC, put that horror in the everyday situation because they need to peel it back. They need to pull the rock up and see what is underneath.
You can see this reflected in another part of Monster of the Week's principles, that being build up a coherent mythology of the world you play. It wants you to make these situations make sense in a greater context. And that calls back to X-Files and the whole mythology arcs and that type of genre television where, okay, so I get a bit of this picture when I watch one episode, but then I have to watch these particular episodes or play these particular sessions of the game to really get into what the B-plot is.
And one of the underlying things, and I never saw this in Monster of the Week until we started this outline and you kind of unveiled some of these aspects, but Monster of the Week is looking for these scary things. There's a solution to it. There is a reason. There are rules. There's this mythology. That coherent mythology is your answer. That's why the scary things that bump in the night are things you can defeat.
Yeah. And I think that appeals to a very different player mindset than the other two urban fantasy games. Especially when you look at Monster Hearts, when I was looking for a comparable principle to that one, you get make monsters seem human and vice versa, give side characters simple, divisive motivations. Monster Hearts is aware that the most interesting parts of the game aren't going to come from the big bad off screen. It's going to be all the dirty laundry that's going to get aired between your characters, or your player characters, rather.
Right, player characters, side characters, both. And that's interesting because Monster Hearts doesn't look for that answer. There is no coherent mythology underneath.
Yeah, a lot of the mythology in that game is dependent on what your players bring to the table. If your players have a question about, well, is my vampire weak towards running water, or would my werewolf be defeated by a silver bullet? As the MC, you can always shrug and go, well, does it say anything on your character sheet? No? Well, you tell me. Mm-hmm. It's your mythology. What do you want to bring? And you can have variances there because, of course, you have cliques, and another thing, Monster Hearts encourages you to put labels. They're teenagers. You want to force them into little boxes where they crack out their own identity that makes them different from the crowd, except they're going to want to join crowds. They're allowed to form parts of their identity on their own, which is, given that Monster Hearts is an exploration of puberty and teenage development, giving the players that power is very important.
Right.
I also find, again, interesting is Urban Shadows encourages the MC to display the city almost as a character, display the city from the skyscrapers to the slums, and treat everyone according to their station, which says to me it wants to invoke class and demographic barriers that we see in urban settings.
Which ties into Urban Shadows and the advancement that you have to go to each of the factions. That principle reinforces that you have to work within different cliques within that urban life.
Yeah, you have to be connected, which is a barrier, I think. It's something that's been discussed online, is some players have difficulty engaging that faction dynamic of the game. The game basically says, here's your XP track, player. You have to go talk to someone of each faction or do something involving them in order to advance your character. You have to tie yourself in. Which has resulted in, there's been discussion online about, do you take that XP mechanic out and replace it with one that's driven by making fail rolls or highlighted stats, which really does a disservice for what that game is trying to talk about.
Maybe it's just not a game that you advance through very quickly unless your character is bouncing through all the factions.
Oh no, you gotta socially leverage everything and be like,
exactly.
I need to get this XP. Who have I not talked to in the Wild faction recently? We're gonna do a thing right now. That's how I play it, at least. I don't know what your experiences have been like with that particular part of the game.
I haven't been lucky enough to play Urban Shadows over a long period. It's always been a series, mini-series or one-shots for me. So I am aware of the frustration, but I haven't actually felt it myself.
For me as a player, I never got that frustration. But I usually play characters in Urban Shadows that are more socially focused and need things from other people. And I think that makes the game run a little bit smoother for me.
Yeah, it assumes that approach, I think.
But yeah, so looking at these principles, we can see how these games, even though they're part of the same genre and they want to fulfill similar ideas, are saying, no, I want to focus on this part of the genre or that part of the genre. Monsters of the Week is, of course, it's not, I wouldn't call it quite a hack and slash, but it's supernatural. It's very reminiscent in my head of, I don't know if there's a particular term for it, but those 1980s action TV shows where people would drive around in a car and go to different communities and solve problems. So Knight Rider or, oh God, A-Team.
Yeah, good one. It's not quite the 80s, wasn't it? Late 70s, 80s, but the Hulk goes from town to town. I think there was a werewolf show on USA Network here that had that as well. So yeah, it was definitely a subgenre of travel to new city or town and find problem and then solve problem.
Scooby-Doo, for lack of a better one. The one I always think of, and I can never remember the proper name of it, it was cut into the Master Ninja episodes of Mystery Science Fair, where it's about a Master Ninja and his young sidekick, and they have a pet hamster, and they go around in a van. Because why?
Yes, that's
and occasionally
adorable.
They cut away to the hamster.
That's great. What other observations have you made about some of the principles and within these three?
I looked at principles that would lead the GM or MC to guide how the setting interacts with the players. Urban Shadows has the very evocative, dirty the hands of all involved, which says to me, nobody gets out of these situations clean.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you could argue with Monster Hearts. I mean, Monster Hearts can be a very messy game. I have had players who have aspired to try to keep themselves as clean as possible, socially speaking. It doesn't work out very well. But Monster of the Week, you can play characters who are badasses with hearts of gold, who really want to do the good thing, and going and doing the thing does not necessarily mean hurting them or corrupting them in some way. I mean, like, Urban Shadows has literally the corruption track. The more you dig in, the worse things get.
Yeah, it's pretty irrevocable.
When I ran it as a one-shot at QCC, I put my players in positions where, well, do you hit that corruption button right now? Do you take the big risk and get the big reward at the long-term expense of your character? So to counterpoint, in Monster of the Week, has very violent, pointed ways the setting will interact with the players as per the principles. We have nothing is safe, kill bystanders and minions, burn down buildings, let monsters be slain. Rich, what does that say to you about what type of game that Monster of the Week wants to be?
It wants to be an action movie. It wants to have a definite ending, right? It's Monster of the Week. It's not Monster of the Season, right? You let monsters be slain. Let there be carnage. Go a little wild with your descriptions as an MC of things that this monster is doing. Keep amping up the stakes. That's what this principle says to me.
Yeah, drive the game hard. If there isn't at least one explosion, well, maybe there should have been.
You've got an unlimited budget. Go for it.
Oh, don't go for the lousy monster suit. Go for the really nice one.
Yes, exactly.
Monster Hearts 2, to look at our third option. Make labels matter, find the catch, and give everyone a messy life. I love how inwardly focused the principles in Monster Hearts are, because it does speak to me a lot of how, in that game in particular, you have to focus on the players and what they want to do and how you can get in their way. Your big overarching plot doesn't matter. Whatever those players are going to explode between each other is going to be what you spotlight on.
Right. Find the catch. Look for the little weakness. Embrace the melodrama. Your monsters can seem human. All of that ties together so well within representing the themes of Monster Hearts 2. These are really astutely pointed out.
Yeah, so I think that those were the principles that I went through and pulled out that said most to me about directing where to go as an MC in terms of establishing what this game is going to be about in theme and what tones you want to hit on. And again, they're very varied. I reached out to the community on G+ and asked, with principles, how do you interact with them? What something you've learned from them? And some of the replies we had suggested that some MCs printed out what those principles were for that particular game and gave them to the players during character gen, so the players could get a better idea of what to drive towards.
That's a really cool idea. I worry about, for a one-shot with people who don't have experience, looking at basic moves plus the playbook plus something else, but with a group that at least has their feet wet within that game, I think it could be really helpful.
I think it would help the health of a long-term game. I've seen the urban fantasy games in particular fall apart a couple sessions in because they wandered a little bit too far away from the principles. Monster Hearts tends to be the biggest candidate in this group for me in terms of, well, about 4 sessions in, you're going to figure out if this game's going to last or if this game's not going to last, depending on how players are approaching the subject matter and keeping it on point to be about personal horror rather than, hey, I built my character and now I have super high stats in combat and I'm just going to slaughter everything. Because that's not fun.
No, it's hard to play to find out what happens when what happens is you have threes and everything and these crazy moves that swap out all your bad stuff and you just romp all over everything. It's really not that fun.
I think with one-shots, it may be advantageous to maybe not give them the printout, particularly with some of these games that have tons of paperwork already, but instead go over with the players the tone conversation and work the principles into that. So if I was running an Urban Shadows one-shot, I would say this game is about conflict and how you respond to conflict and what conflicts you value over others and what professional and personal relationships you value. So consider that, which is something that came up when I ran my one-shot. I'd like to go back to my one-shot because I think my process of planning out that game revealed where we can really fall back on these principles to help us get out of MC situations and hiccups. I wrote out my notes for my game, and I was really in love with this mystery I had created. Like, oh, here's this really cool situation, and my players are going to have their minds blown because they hadn't thought of putting this in an Urban Shadows game. And then when I was at work one day, I sat back when I was sort of thinking out how would I present this at the table. I went, that's not what Urban Shadows is at all. I've been writing a Monster of the Week game. But I submitted an Urban Shadows game, so I better figure out how does this become an Urban Shadows game really quickly.
That's a really good realization, and a good thing you didn't discover it 15 minutes into the game.
Oh, that would have been stressful. But I did go to that conflict principle and said, all right, so the mystery isn't what the players really need to fiddle with. It's how do people react to this and where do they get dragged off to in the political spectrum? And the game went amazing because I presented this situation and talked, what does it look like the next day after this thing happens? You're seeing visions of the future and other parties are getting involved. What does that mean? Who do you pursue? Who do you make alliances with? And that was fantastic. Like, we had players who should not have had supernatural alliances with each other but we're both business owners. So it's better for us to be together and support the business of the community rather than letting someone from outside this business community call the shots for us.
Like a spooky neighborhood watch. That's cool.
I ran in Niagara Falls. There's this really ridiculous touristy area called Clifton Hill where everything supernatural could legitimately exist in real life. And I just shoved everything in there.
Cool.
And people picked sides. It was great. Do you have any other thoughts, having looked at these principles in terms of urban fantasy? Something you maybe taken away from them that you didn't consider before, Rich?
The main part about how Monster Hearts 2 is so elegantly presenting a particular style of high school supernatural melodrama. I love that you pulled out those three things and identified, how should the players emotionally react to things? How does the setting affect the game? And what is the setting like? I think those categories that you pulled out are a great way of teaching how well these games are designed to evoke a particular way to play them.
Monster Hearts is so beautifully well done. When I started running Apocalypse Engine games, I fell in love with Monster Hearts because I could sort of capture, I see what this game is doing and trying to talk about in terms of teenage development, because I had recently taken a psych course. And I was frustrated because a lot of the games I had encountered and had heard about didn't really touch on that subject matter. They went to very pulpy places, which I can understand because some players don't like exploring those more uncomfortable spaces that game allows people to create. Mm-hmm. But going to the principles, just the idea of the wider world and the wider conflicts don't matter. You could be in a city where Urban Shadows is in fact going on at the same time. That doesn't affect you. You're a teenage kid. That's not what you care about. You care about what is your social standing, who are you connected with, and what do you do when your dad comes home after working an overnight shift and your mom has drunk out of her mind. That happened in the game I ran. What does that do to you as a person?
That's the question that you put at stake. That's where you want to push, and the principles help guide you there. Another thing that I found from looking at this, having this conversation with you, is it reinforces the things that I intuit when I look at my MC moves. I've seen conversations online on Google+, on RPG Geek, and other places where people talk about when they look at PBTA or Apocalypse Engine games, well, the GM's not rolling dice, it's all GM Fiat. Well, it's not. There are moves that I can make, and there are principles guiding those moves that help to support me in why I would make one move over another, right? Instead of just always hitting the hammer bar of I'm going to do harm as established, do harm as established. Well, no, Right now I'm playing Monster of the Week. I want to kill bystanders and minions. That's one of my principles. Okay, that's not harm is established, but guess what? I got this big monster. Let's reinforce that. Oh, well, your guy can spend luck and ignore that harm. Bam, I just killed your cousin. Now what do you do?
Always gut punch off screen. That's what I learned from Monster Hearts.
Someone else gut punched. That's what you do.
Exactly. And I agree with you. When researching for this particular episode, I had found other spaces where people had looked at the principles and said the principles are really what prevents this idea of unlimited GM Fiat, because the principles say, yes, you can use these moves to do these things, but this is what you should be doing. And if you stray too far, then you're not really playing this game anymore. In the process of preparing for this episode, Rich and I decided to go through a couple of Apocalypse Engine games that we really liked and grab the principles that speak to us in terms of how to establish the world and how to shape your reactions to the players in order to help build a sense of space and location, help reinforce what the game should really be about, things that are evocative and speak to you. Rich, you want to start us off?
I'll be happy to. I'm going to start with the Grand Poobah Apocalypse World. Barf 4th Apocalyptica.
So good!
I know, right? Barf, right? That word alone just makes me feel gross, but that's what it's supposed to do, right? It encourages me to make things weird and off kilter, to be evocative, to go for what's fascinating. Gives me permission to let my mind run wild. And the example that is given in Apocalypse World 2nd Edition of bone on the inside of eyelids of dogs, and you can hear the click-clack in the night, like, okay, I get it. That's pretty amazing principle, right? That's not a move. That's just barfing forth Apocalyptica. Judd Carlman is amazing at stuff like that. Another one is Look Through Crosshairs. I came from a history where I had precious NPCs. I really enjoyed doing their voices. They were always around to support and sometimes be more important than player characters. And then I come into Apocalypse World and I'm told, look through crosshairs. Nothing I've created is precious. The world is going to tear down establishments, relationships, people. There are no monoliths. Everything has a countdown clock on it. It was not until I really applied Look Through Crosshairs that the idea of this hardholder NPC or this big bad, it is okay for the player characters to take them down like that, because I'm looking through crosshairs. And sometimes the aftermath of that boss going down is way more interesting than that person strutting around and delivering their big speech of how badass they are. Like, look through crosshairs, let things get torn down, see what happens in the aftermath. It is an apocalyptic world.
Yeah, it's always more interesting to give the players the ruins of the community they steamrolled and say, okay, now what? There's still people here. The big bad's dead. What happens now?
Definitely.
That's like the beginning of a whole campaign right there.
Exactly. You should lead off with a big fight. Like, that's the opening scene.
I read a lot of X-Wing novels when I was younger, but I also read The Bandy Papers, which is a series of Canadian dark humor war novels, which seems like a weird sentence to say, about a fighter pilot during World War I and what happens to him during the war and in the aftermath. And Night Witch's principles spoke to me of the world Donald Jack creates in those books, although with a slightly different focus on the Russian pilots instead of the Royal Air Force with the conscripted Canadians. So the two that stand out to me here are give each plane's tail number and duty station a personality, and give each NPC a name, a past, and no mercy. So you humanize the inhuman objects, and you brutally slaughter the humans you build up. That actually sounds about par for the course for fighter pilot fiction. Because a lot of it is about how these inanimate objects stand in for relationships because these pilots don't have a lot of human relationships. And the ones that they do have, you could be reading one chapter and it's like, oh, so-and-so's plane goes down, and you're like, I'm reading this and I'm in grade 10. I'm like, oh, Jesus, I'm reading war fiction. That character I really liked is dead. There is no body. It went down behind enemy lines. And that's what speaks to me, the idea of no mercy, but you also want your players to cry if something happens to their plane, because their plane is going to be an emotional center in that game.
Yeah.
But you still want to have that connection there with the NPCs that are going to become collateral damage. I mean, they're just going to become things that you get rid of in order to up the stakes.
Yeah.
Again, simple, but I think it speaks a lot to building an intense world where, well, nothing is forever and everything is going to die at some point.
So depressing.
It's very depressing.
It is. That is a hard game.
It is it's an intense game that makes very careful choices in terms of where it wants to focus its lens. Because the flying sections are pretty much a background thing. It's like, what do you do in the middle of the night? And then the rest of it's going to be drama in your airbase. So on a lighter note, Rich.
Yes, on a lighter note, after this depressing night wishes you shared with us, I go with Masks: A New Generation. The 3 principles that I adore describe like a comic book. When I run games, I often do it like a TV show or a movie. I talk about certain shots, and I even make jokes about, like I did earlier, budgets and aspects of TV shows and movies. But there's this principle, describe like a comic book. And that reminds me of where we are. It allows me to chat about poses and word balloons and double-page spreads. And occasionally, when I stop the game for a bio break, I'll say that we've hit the staple. You know, you're right in the middle.
Oh my gosh.
Another principle is give villains drives to feature their humanity. I absolutely appreciate this because when I think of older comics from my youth, they were pretty dumb generally. And giving villains humanity allows me from having to dive into the Golden and Silver Age comic issues where supervillains were always robbing banks for no reason other than allowing the heroes to go do a cool thing, or that's not interesting to me. That's not a comic book that I want to read. When the villains have issues that they're trying to solve, when they have problems, when they're somewhat sympathetic, that makes them compelling and that makes them memorable. That is a principle that has made my Masks game so much stronger. And then the last one is remind them of the generations that came before. That's important to me because, first of all, Masks has its own, it doesn't have an extremely long background, right? It doesn't have a bunch of lore, but it sets forth that there are certain generations, and those generations are great because the player characters as young adults, young supers, they need something to strive against. They need not just villains to fight, but establishments to rebel against. This is a lived-in world, and there are capes and cowls that have been here for decades. That legacy is important to make the setting sing and to allow it to respond to the player characters in a cohesive kind of narrative and world. So that's why I love those principles from Masks. What's our last game that you wanted to highlight some principles from?
Okay, to wrap us up, Sagas of the Icelanders. I am fascinated by this game in so many ways, mostly because it really irritates people who think that we're going to play a game about Vikings going and raiding different countrysides, right? No. So let's take a look at the principles that these go a little bit into game mechanics, but my God, how they're written. Put your heart and brain on the table. Just the amount of visceral imagery there.
Nice.
Put your emotions and your logic out there for people to interact with. Throw it under the grinding stone of time.
Wow.
Yeah, like there's part of Sagas that it doesn't really get addressed in one-shot games, but it's meant to be a game about how generations of people change the community and how they make spaces for the people who come after. And the idea that, throw it under the grinding stone of time, nothing is going to last forever. This is all going to get ground down into the ground, and maybe something else will come of it later. Make the world cold. Well, I guess it is Iceland, but we can also interpret that as the harshness of, well, this is a community of people who are growing up fairly isolated with limited resources. Traveling in and out is very difficult. Relationships in between the communities, particularly depending on if you have one of the community leaders, the Gothi or the matriarch, stand out as the two big ones for playbooks there. Dealing with the other communities is not going to be hunky-dory. These are communities that are under stress. You might as well be playing an Apocalypse World game, but set back in, I think it's like 2 or 1000 AD. I'd have to actually check the date. But a considerable amount of time in isolation.
Very considerable.
And the final one, give them the sun and make them fight for the moon. That reflects a lot of the principles you see game mechanic-wise. Give the players what they want to make them fight for what they need. But the idea of give them the sun and make them fight for the moon makes it a little bit more abstract. Give the players what they want, but also keep something precious away that they'd have to fight for and push for and drive the story towards.
It's called the Sagas of the Icelanders, and the principles kind of feel like little koans or poems in their own way. That's neat.
It's a very poetic game.
All right. Rach, is there anything else about principles and how they help to enforce or reflect themes that you wanted to talk about?
I just want to encourage players or GMs, even if you're already midway through a campaign, take a moment to step back and look at those principles. Sometimes people will give them a glance and internalize them, but it can never hurt to look at them and in some cases gain inspiration and think about something in a new way that's going to drive your game harder and more intensely. Because that's really what you want to do, is hit those genre notes that make sense for your game to give players to latch onto and drive your story forward.
Awesome. Well, Rach, thank you so much for this topic that we could talk about this time around. This was really fun.
I'm glad you had such a good time talking about it, because it's a little bit weird, and I had to sit there and be like, I have to think about how we're going to present it. And I think we've covered a lot of ground tonight.
I think we did too. Everybody, thank you so much for listening. If you've got feedback about how you use MC principles, are there any games that you want to highlight? Feel free to jump on gauntlet-rpg.com and find this particular episode. You can find us on the Gauntlet community on Google Plus and give us feedback there. Again, you like PBTA games, we like PBTA games. The Gauntlet community is running, I run a PBTA game every Saturday morning cartoons. I am pretty much guaranteed to be running. And also, October 1st is when Gauntlet Con will be available to non-patrons. If you're a patron for Gauntlet right now, you should jump on, because there are all kinds of games for Gauntlet Con that you can register for right now. But non-patrons, folks who are not interested in dipping your toe into that aspect but would like to play some games for Gauntlet Con October 1st, check our website and we will give you the route to that, and you can sign up for any of the games that are left. Rach, thanks so much for jumping on and being a part of the second season of Plus One Forward. You are my favorite co-host.
Yay! Wait, I'm your only co-host.
Well, yeah, you're so quick on the drive. We were supposed to figure that out after we stopped recording, and then you're just too smart, Rach. All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and have a good afternoon or evening based on your time zone.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at @+1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Hammer of Bill. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.